Good afternoon, students. So in this video, I will give you an example of how you can do your reader response journal, 9 literary terms journal that's due in week 2. So here we're going to do an analysis on Telltale Heart by Edgar Allan Poe. Now, I read this story in high school, and I thought at the time it was so creepy. And so basically the exposition, in other words, what is this story about? So exposition is the backstory or background to the story. So here in the Telltale Heart, the narrator checks on an old man for 7 nights at midnight. And so every night at midnight, when the old man is sleeping, this young man would open the door to the old man's bedroom to check to see if the old man is asleep. And the old man, night after night, could sense that somebody was watching him, and he would wake up terrified that somebody was in the bedroom with him, somebody terrifying. And each night the narrator would check in on the old man. And then the one thing that's strange about the narrator is that the narrator keeps insisting from the very beginning that he is not insane. And then he insists, then the narrator says that he wants to kill the old man because of the old man's eye. Now, I don't know, that to me that's very insane. And yet the old man had never done anything wrong to that young man. So basically the exposition is when the author reveals the background to the story, the backdrop to the story, the setting and location and time of the story. So so exposition is similar to triggering event, where you find out the background, the backdrop to the story. And so here you have conflict. So here the narrator is struggling between, the conflict in the story, conflict is defined as struggle between opposing forces. And in this story, the narrator is conflicted as to whether or not he is sane or insane to want to kill an old man just because he doesn't like the way the old man's eyes look. And so in this story, it's man versus self, or person versus self. In other words, this narrator has inner conflict inside himself, so that it's between his mind and himself. So person versus self. So that is the inner conflict. The outer conflict is between the protagonist, the young man, the murderer, who wants to kill the old man's eye. So the old man and the young man, those are the two opposing forces. So that's person versus person. So in Telltale Heart, the conflict is man versus self and person versus person. A protagonist is the main character. He's the narrator. He's the person who is telling the story. So the protagonist is the main character or narrator. And in this story, the protagonist is the narrator, the unnamed murderer of the old man. And and what makes this story creepy is you're not sure whether or not the narrator is sane or insane. So the inner conflict within the narrator also manifests itself in tension, so that we get some kind of suspense, because we're not sure if what we're reading is actually true or not true. So protagonist is the main character. Antagonist is the opposing force of the story. So usually you have the hero and the villain. So the hero of the story, although in this case he's not quite a hero, is the protagonist, and usually the antagonist is the villain. So I mentioned this in the week 2 lecture. So here in this story, the antagonist or villain of the story is the old man's eye. Okay, so just think, somebody's eye can be like your opposing force. So I guess that means that the narrator has really gone crazy. Now, the suspense is the rising action, that is the events leading to the climax. So the narrator is an unreliable point of view, insane narrator. So the reader doubts his sanity. His diction is uneven, colloquial, and intimate, drawing the reader into his private, crazy thoughts, which makes for a kind of crazy story. And then you don't know whether or not this young man is crazy enough to actually kill the old man. So you keep asking yourself, each night when the young man checks in on the old man sleeping, you ask yourself, is this the night he's going to kill that old man? And so that is the suspense, the rising action. The crisis means decision or dilemma, the do or die moment for the narrator, where the narrator gathers all his force to defeat, or all his strength to defeat the opposing force. So the crisis is the inner struggle within the narrator to decide whether or not to murder the old man because of his eye, as well as the inner struggle, or the conflict inside himself, man versus self, whether or not insanity versus sanity. So that's the crisis. Should he or should he not kill the old man? So that's the crisis. Foreshadowing. Foreshadowing is when Edgar Allan Poe, the author, drops hints to the reader of what will happen later in the story. So when, from the very beginning of the story, the narrator says, I'm not insane. I'm just unstable, but I'm not insane or crazy. So right from the very beginning, from the very first paragraph, Edgar Allan Poe drops us hints that the narrator will go insane by the end of the story. So foreshadowing is when the author, or the author of the story, Poe, Edgar Allan Poe, drops hints of what will happen later in the story. The climax is the most intense portion of the story. It is the highest point of tension. So in this story, the climax is when the narrator murders the old man, throws the old man on the floor, chops up his limbs, and buries him under the floorboards. That's the climax. Conclusion is the resolution or ending to the story that gives the reader closure. So when the police arrive at the murderer's house to investigate the missing old man, because by this time the old man's family has reported him missing, and the police is going house to house to search for the old man to see where he is. So finally the police arrives at the narrator's house, and at first the narrator invites the police into his living room, and they even have tea. But then the insanity of the narrator kicks in as he hears the beating heart, as it gets louder and louder, of the dead old man under the floorboards. And then the reader realizes that it's not the old man's heart that's beating louder and louder, it's the narrator's guilty heart beating louder and louder. But the narrator thinks it's the old man's heart. He thinks he's being haunted by the old man. Actually, it's his guilt. So the beating heart is a metaphor for the narrator's guilt. So finally, overcome by guilt, the narrator, the unnamed murderer, so this is the conclusion and the resolution or ending of the story, he finally admits to the police he's the one who murdered the old man. So that is the plot structure, story structure of Telltale Heart. And so here, this is an example of what you're going to define and do all of this for your next, for the story, God's Son's, for the other story, Godfather's Death, yeah. So for the other story, Godfather's Death, you're going to take these 9 literary terms. You're going to define these terms and then give examples from Godfather's Death. So what is the conflict in Godfather's Death? What is the exposition in Godfather's Death? Who's the protagonist in Godfather's Death? What is the suspense or rising action in Godfather's Death? Who is the antagonist in Godfather's Death? What crisis occurs? What is the do or die moment for the narrator? Crisis moment in Godfather's Death. What foreshadowing occurs? What hints does the author give in Godfather's Death that will tell you what will happen later in the story? And what is the climax, the most exciting moment of the story in Godfather's Death? And here you have the conclusion. What is the conclusion of Godfather's Death? So here you have the nine literary words that you're going to use for your reader response journal. And I just gave you an example of how you could do this for Telltale Heart. And I remember Telltale Heart being my favorite story, and it was really creepy too. We also did a few other Edgar Allan Poe stories as well. So anyway, so if you have any questions about how to do your reader response journal, you can always email me.